Okay, final installment in relation to arguments. So guys, we've gone from looking at how you actually flip evidence when we're broadening the ideas to make those overarching arguments that formulate the basis for proving our thesis, which ultimately answers the question. Now, essentially what you end up with, and obviously yours would be somewhat more specific because you would have actual quotes, but I'll get to that in a sec. You have your essay tree where you've got your question, your thesis, and your overarching arguments. Now, these two highlighted sections here, the two sentences, are what we just brainstormed back here. So these ideas here, what we've broadened the actual evidence to, becomes these nice sentences that clearly summarize what it is that I'm going to be arguing in relation to what the characters of Calpurnia and Aunt Alexandra offer, all right, in terms of their influence on Scout. What I then do is specify the evidence that I would have in support of this argument. Now, what you'll notice is that my first piece of evidence, and of course you have a quote for each of these pieces of evidence. You always need to have a quote. Obviously I don't, because we're just running over the basic idea of essay structure. But this is our piece of evidence that we initially brainstormed over here. All right, where you've actually got us thinking about, okay, I automatically think of the church and what Calpurnia does. We consider how we broaden that idea, and we actually neatly pop it into our essay tree. Now, what I've got here at number 2 is another example of a piece of evidence that I would use to prove that the women in Scout's life provide exposure to the unknown in society. All right, so these are two different pieces of evidence. This is where you would actually be repeating the evidence and explanation of evidence in your teal paragraph structure. All right, so if you were actually looking at teal, this is the topic sentence and your explanation sentence. This is where you provide the evidence. This is where you explain the evidence. That is how you actually go in building your teal paragraph structure to incorporate more than one piece of evidence. So that's actually why planning it like this, when you've got heaps of evidence rolling around in your head, this is why this plan is so important. Okay. Again, you'll notice down here that our second idea that stemmed from the big quote about Aunt Alexandra is reinforcing and educating Scout about her place in society. So again, we've come from here where we've broadened the idea, we've shoved it into our essay plan, and what I've actually done again is provided another piece of evidence I could use. Notice how, because we've broadened the argument, we can actually incorporate evidence from both women. This argument, it just so happens that both of my pieces of evidence relate to Calpurnia. This, however, shows I'm able to consider both women in relation to how they reinforce and educate Scout about her place in society. So this is why it's so important to broaden your ideas, guys. This makes it easier to get your word count up, to actually explain what you mean to answer the question. Now, this third one is actually one that I've just thrown in there to show you how you can actually, combine a general idea. You might find that you've got heaps to say about these two arguments, so you might only need 2 overarching arguments. If you had to write a 1,200 word essay though, like in year 12, for example, generally speaking, you'll probably need 3 arguments, or you need some really solid evidence to be expanding on in relation to your 2 arguments if you're going to have 2. This one I thought to cover the fact that these women, because of the lack of a mother figure, they offer the maternal perspective on life. So a clear example is when Calpurnia actually chastises Scout about her manners towards Walter Cunningham for putting molasses all over his food. And another simple one is where Alexandra is always harping on about appropriate behaviour for young girls. Now, Now, you'd have to be very careful if you were going with this third argument and with this piece of evidence in particular, that you don't just double up what you're saying here. These are distinctly different arguments, but the evidence you use could be very similar. So you've got to be clear about what it is that you'd be analysing in this. But that's your general understanding. I'll pop these sheets up for you to have a look at as well. But hopefully that will take you from looking at a question and coming up with your thesis and how you actually respond to that thesis.